Congressman Grimm, my name is Danny Panzella, as you well know, and since I didn't get a chance to make my voice heard at the town hall meeting tonight, I did want to give you some comments and provide some other insights into some of the issues that were raised. It seems like we have a left versus right paradigm in American politics where Republicans and Democrats are constantly fighting with each other. The middle class battles over these issues, and we have 8 years of a Republican and then 8 years of a Democrat, and it's a ping pong game and nothing really ever gets done. Nothing really changes in American politics. The truth is, neither party is any more or less controlled by the top corporations. We all know the saying, he who has the gold makes the rules. American politics is no exception to this. He who has the gold gets to fund the campaigns and buy favors back from the politicians. I just want to give a couple of brief examples. I still see a lot of the things that you're doing are unconstitutional, a lot of the votes that you're casting. The first being, you voted no to bring the troops home from the Afghan war. The Afghan war is not a constitutionally declared war. It has gone on far too long, and it is time to bring those troops home. The second is you voted to extend the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act and the Constitution, specifically the Fourth and Fifth Amendments especially, cannot coexist. The Patriot Act eviscerates due process, it eviscerates habeas corpus, and it is a complete violation of everything that America is purported to be. What makes us different from other tyrannies across the globe? That we have rights, that we respect of people, of all humans, because our rights are not just for American citizens, they are for all people that are created by God. That's what conservatives believe, is it not? That our rights are endowed to us by God by virtue of the fact that we are born. We possess these inalienable rights that the Constitution enumerated. The Constitution was written to limit the government from infringing on the rights of all humanity. It's what Obama would call negative rights. He tries to spin it because he wants to change that. But he calls it negative rights. But it is negative rights in a sense because it's the negative rights of the government. The government is forbidden to create laws limiting free speech or keeping people from being able to defend themselves via the Second Amendment. Having the Fourth Amendment, having the right to be secure in our persons, possessions, our property rights, which is where we derive much of our rights from property rights. The unconstitutional income tax is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. My wages that I work hard for, I trade my time for wages, that's my property. And the government does not have the right to take my property via force, the force of the IRS. What ends up being the IRS pointing a gun at my head and saying, I'm going to put you in jail if you don't give me your property. That's theft. 99% of the spending that Congress is doing is unconstitutional. 99% of the agencies and all the spending, whether it's the war spending, which the left gets very upset about, or it's entitlement spending that the right gets very upset about, it's all unconstitutional. There is very little that is done constitutionally. If you want to spend money to defend this country, which I think is, you're absolutely 100% right, the federal government's role is to defend this country. That's its primary role, and to mediate disputes between the states. If you want to spend money to protect this country, we need to start shutting down all the bases that we have all across the world and secure our borders and keep America safe and stop interfering in foreign policy, because that's where the blowback comes from. You also mentioned that we stopped many terror plots. If you do research, forget about what the mainstream media reports. If you do research into these attacks, most of them were set up by the feds where they entrapped, whether the people are real terrorists or not is irrelevant. They probably are. They probably would commit a terrorist attack, but we're funding, just like Al-Qaeda, we are funding them, we're giving them the weapons, and we're saying, here, go, do this. Then we want to clap and say, oh, the FBI and the CIA did its job when it stopped the terrorist attack. They knew the terrorist attack was going to happen because they helped set it up to entrap the terrorists, which is great. Now we've got a terrorist behind bars. But let's not pretend like this is the system working. If the feds never gave them the weapons or the money, the attack never would have happened. Then you have Al-Qaeda, who it's out in the open was set up by the CIA. Bin Laden was on the CIA payroll on record until 2 weeks before 9/11. So the US government sets up Al-Qaeda to fight the Russians in communism, and then it turns around and bites us in the rear end later on. Same thing with Saddam. We put Saddam into power. We put the Shah of Iran into power. Over and over again. Noriega. We have all these instances where we put these despotic dictators into power, these terrorists into power, and then 10 years down the road they become our enemy. Maybe if we stop getting involved and putting these dictators in power, we wouldn't have to then remove them and spend American taxpayers, the American middle class pays for these wars to then remove these dictators that the US should never have put into power to begin with. I want to remind you of your duty to your representatives. You have two duties. One is your oath to the Constitution, and that is your primary duty. Your second duty is to represent Staten Islanders and South Brooklyn. Now, if your constituents give you a directive, if the majority of your constituents are saying they want you to do something and that thing is unconstitutional, well, you have the duty and the responsibility to take a leadership role and show your constituents why that is unconstitutional, and therefore you are forbidden by the Constitution to do that thing. We did not elect you for you to go to Congress and just do whatever you feel like doing. We elected you to represent our interests, which means you don't get to rely on your own opinions, your own understanding. You're to consult your constituents, and it is our responsibility as constituents to make our voices very clearly heard to you in whatever way possible, through town halls, through calling your office, sending you emails and letters, and writing letters to the advance, and all these avenues that free speech allows us to keep you accountable to us. Another thing I want to address is your call for respect. You talk a lot about respect, and you were very upset, and you went on the Steve Malzberg show and you talked about how people who called you rhinos were very insulting. You even implied that it was a threat for a constituent to call you a rhino if you weren't lining up with conservative values. Yet you'll come to a town hall meeting and call your constituents, whether you agree with them or not, to call your constituents tree huggers because they're concerned about the environment, whether they're completely right, whether they want to do things that are unconstitutional is irrelevant. Their ideas may be flawed, but their heart is in the right place, that they want to protect the environment. To call them tree huggers is condescending and it's disrespectful. And if you want respect from your constituents to not call you names, then you need to stop calling your constituents names. You called me an extremist. You said that I was an extremist, and the other 60 or some odd freshman Tea Party candidates were extremists because they criticized you for voting for the continuing resolution. And I agree with you to some degree that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, and it's very difficult for politicians to come out and take controversial stands because they're going to be punished no matter what. You're going to piss off 50% of the people either way. So, but that's where your constitutional oath comes in. You can always rely on the Constitution, and no matter who's criticizing you, if you stand by the Constitution, they cannot criticize you because you are limited by that. So if a leftist wants you to do something, or a right-winger wants you to do something, and it's unconstitutional, you can always rely on that. And that's why if you follow the Constitution, you will never have a problem, because you will always be covered by those principles. Tactics. You've talked a lot about tactics in your previous media appearances. If a tactic is unconstitutional, it is unacceptable. There is no excuse. Well, you have called yourself a constitutionalist. You have taken your serious oath to the Constitution. That means you may not violate it. It is illegal for you to violate your constitutional oath against the law. So when you do this, you are breaking the law, and quite honestly, even though it's never done anymore, these are impeachable offenses. You talked a lot about bringing money back to Staten Island and serving Staten Island. My question is, why do we have to send our tax money to the federal government for things it has no business being involved in, only for you to beg for that money back so we can build a North Shore Railroad or do other projects. Think very seriously about that. Another thing that was discussed was the economy and the liberals in the room calling to tax the rich. Well, here my opinion on this is the income tax is illegal. It is unconstitutional, therefore being illegal. For much of our history, we had no income tax, and the country ran just fine. The Republicans and the Democrats, President Clinton, along with Newt Gingrich and Bush Sr. before that, worked together to create NAFTA and GATT. These trade agreements are what caused our manufacturing base to be shipped overseas and into Mexico. We cannot talk seriously about reindustrializing the United States and getting the economy back on track without, I agree with you about lowering taxes on corporations, the income taxes. I think these taxes should be done away with. Lowering taxes, we know historically it works. Reaganomics worked. You create freedom, economic liberty that promotes growth. But we cannot talk about cutting taxes without also talking about repealing NAFTA and GATT and instituting tariffs on foreign-made products so that our manufacturing base in America has the ability to compete. The tax breaks alone aren't enough. We cannot compete with slave labor in China and India. We just can't do it. We need tariffs instituted. We need NAFTA and GATT repealed. And do you have the courage to bring up this conversation in Congress? The last issue I want to discuss briefly is hydrofracking. I, like you, who I'm for oil drilling, I think we need to reduce foreign dependency on oil. As long as the oil companies are responsible, unlike BP, who is such a huge monopoly giant that it basically feels like it can get away with anything, I think we need to deregulate, have more competition in the oil industry, and we've got to get rid of the monopolies, especially foreign-owned monopolies like BP, which is majority owned by the Dutch and British royal families. Hydrofracking is a very dangerous technique for farming natural gas. I implore you to look into this. Look into hydrofracking and what it is doing to the water sources of the farmers. This is not a tree hugger issue. Yes, we need to be good stewards of the planet, absolutely. We also need to provide cheap energy to get our economy back on track. And I am all for safely drilling for natural gas or drilling for oil. If you look at the process of hydrofracking, the companies drill down into the earth and then they drill out laterally in 8 different directions. Then they pump it's water, but it's also 500 different chemicals which are pumped at high pressure down into the shale. It expands out into the shale, and then the natural gas comes back up through the pipeline. What this is doing is causing the water to be poisoned. People are getting cancer in record numbers in the areas where they're doing this shale fracking. It's killing animals. It is destroying the environment. This is a property rights issue. These people's property, their very bodies and lives are being destroyed by this process that has gone completely unregulated. And yes, I'm sure you can find research that says it's safe, but the proof is in the pudding. If you look at the testimony of these people, you can see they turn on their faucets and flames come out of the faucets because of the natural gas getting into their drinking water supplies. We need to protect our water supply. I strongly urge you to research this issue more in depth. And again, I want to remind you, you don't represent any corporate lobby. You represent your constituents, and you must protect our rights, our constitutional rights. That includes our property rights and the right for us to have clean water in our property and in our cities. Thank you for taking the time to watch this, Mr. Grimm. As I implored your predecessor, Mr. McMahon, don't represent your party. Don't represent corporate interests who fund your campaigns and donate to you, and I'm sure there's many lobbyists trying to woo you and buy you with favors. Represent the people of Staten Island.